Dave Aranda, Sean Bell, Eric Mateos, the whole staff is on the recruiting trail right now. But how does this Baylor program compare to the rest of the Big 12 when it comes to recruiting, especially as this conference changes? John Garcia Jr. joins today's show. This is Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey everybody, Drake Toll here with Sikkim365.com alongside John Garcia Jr., Director of Recruiting at Sports Illustrated, thanking you for making Locked On Baylor your first listen every single today, hitting today the Big 12 and recruiting across the conference as well as Texas. Recruiting in Texas, specifically in Austin, and last but not least, the new Big 12, new 4 teams, how that changes recruiting, all things recruiting today. John, first and foremost, like rapid fire, we're rolling today. Across the Big 12 right now, Baylor and Dave Aranda, they just got their 10th commitment in total, the class of 2023. As they build that class, and even looking at 2022, they've never been one of the premier teams in this league in recruiting, and it doesn't necessarily feel like that's changing, right?
It's a little early for the 23 cycle to make some of those judgments, Drake. But look, this class was just on the outskirts of the top 25. We ranked the top 25 at SI. Baylor was one of the first few under consideration thereafter. So a top 30 group brought in 2022. And 23 is off to a great start. A lot of emphasis, as you would imagine, in the state of Texas. You've got your quarterback locked down in Austin Novosad, who's getting more offers. Stanford just offered him the other day. So folks are waking up a little bit towards his ability as an Elite 11 finalist. So that will be interesting to track. But look, this class is off to a strong start, especially relative to the Big 12. I mean, volume-wise, just a few schools have hit double digits, as you mentioned. Baylor just did. Heavy emphasis in the state of Texas, much like Texas Tech, which has like 1,000 commits at this point. I think they've hit 20. But volume's not the only measure, obviously. You want to measure great players and functional movers who could factor in sooner rather than later when they do get to the college rank. So I think in those regards, Baylor's right in the thick of it, amongst the best in the Big 12 at this point, particularly on defense. So naturally, you want to see where the offensive recruits start to come in and change things. And I think you saw signs of that in the 22 cycle, certainly at wide receiver. And then now in 23, again, you've got your quarterback locked in, and things are looking up for additional targets as well.
John, I can only imagine, I'm not a football coach, but I would like to think it is common sense that teams don't want to bring in 20 different transfers, right, in lieu of a freshman class or recruiting class coming in. But have you seen, even in the last 365 days, a shift in how teams recruit high schoolers now that the transfer portal has become so prevalent and teams are going after double-digit guys in the transfer portal to rebuild their roster rather than taking these high school kids?
Yeah, it's certainly more limited, Drake. I mean, there's another way to put it. There are less scholarships to go around, and until the NCAA, which, we're all waiting for a lot of things from them, until that changes in terms of the limit, or the overall limit, or the limit you could take each year, the high school kids are going to be affected primarily in those conversations. Because if you're looking at a high school recruit and one in college with experience, you're probably going to take the college experience over the high school experience, because why wouldn't you, right? Otherwise. Yeah. So it certainly has limited the, I would say, early offer prowess. Some of these schools, Nebraska, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida State, they were kind of known for sending out hundreds of offers, and you just don't see that anymore. It is a more limited target area, a not as wide a net for recruits. So you got to be more careful with the offers that you do shell out, because there's always a room to add in the transfer portal, and you want to keep that freedom. You don't want to be tied into high school recruits, and then you got to take in some bad PR if you make a move on those guys, right? If you drop them, if you ask them to gray shirt, if you ask them to walk on, PR-wise, it's a huge hit, because they can talk about it and you can't until they sign. So there's a lot of gray area there, as is common in recruiting in general. But there's no doubt, Drake, over the last year, less offers, unless widespread offers beyond that. It's a much more narrow and targeted group of prospects that these schools are looking at. And I think the portal is the primary reason.
John, it's really been an empire for Texas and Oklahoma across the Big 12 in the stronghold over recruiting for the last, I don't know, decade or more even. And obviously that's going to change in 2025. But until then, I can only imagine they'll still be the top two teams in the Big 12 almost perennially. And past that, looking at 3, 4, 5, who are those schools that are doing recruiting at a high level right now, especially from those high school ranks?
That's a great question, Drake. And yeah, I mean, look, it's safe to assume Texas and Oklahoma, probably in that order, by the way, are going to be the recruiting powers in the Big 12, even with change. I do think those schools, their national reach certainly holds strong in the recruiting game. But beyond that, yeah, it's kind of wide open, right? We've seen Baylor occupy that number 3 spot. Oklahoma State has trended into that right spot, when they have great years on the field. I do like what TCU's beginning to do under Sonny Dykes. They actually picked up multiple commits in the last week and are starting to trend up in the right direction and contend with elite recruits elsewhere, outside the region, I should say.
Yeah.
So those are some schools that immediately come to mind, but there's no foregone conclusions in the Big 12. And I think that's, depending on how you look at it, that's either really fun, like it is for me, or probably annoying, like it might be for some of the fan bases there in the Big 12. But yeah, the assumption that Texas, Oklahoma is going to be the top of that conversation and, Kansas is going to be at the bottom of it is probably safe for the foreseeable future. But look, things change on the field, and that means they eventually change in recruiting as well. But, Baylor has shown, Dave Aranda has shown, if you get your guys, if you evaluate the right way, you can, I guess, supersede a ranking that is, bestowed upon you by some third party like myself. So I do think that there's something to be said for that. I mean, schools in the Big 12 and out have lived off of that. And you think of programs like Iowa, Wisconsin, Baylor last year. They have Pitt last year. They have been able to identify their guys and great fits and follow that towards a lot of success. And I think that those things transcend what we conventionally think of as an elite recruit or an elite recruiting class.
John, kind of the last question on that front, and one that this isn't even like built for podcasting. This is just me genuinely curious. I was reading an article from 2021. It was June of 2021. Baylor was top 15 in the nation in recruiting for the class of 2022 on that date. And obviously, since then, Baylor's moved into the 30 range-ish, somewhere around there. What does that say about a program? One of these programs that hits the recruiting trail really early, gets those early commitments that are your 4-star guys, and then past that says, okay, those are my dudes, I'm done, and falls to that 30 spot. Is that a trend you see across teams in college football? And is there some kind of consistency to throw a label on that for a team like Baylor?
I think so. For any team, honestly. Early commitments are often overvalued by our industry, combined with the volume. I think if those two things come together, early commitments and early good commitments, along with some volume beyond it, we can kind of get drunk off of it in our business, and it kind of stays there. That perception kind of hangs right there as you navigate through the rest of the recruiting cycle, and that's probably to the detriment of these teams, because then you lose a guy or two, like in this case Zach Pyron decommitting at quarterback, then it perceptually you're like, whoa, okay, what's going on there? And now you drop them, right? So I do think that there's good and bad that come with it. And it's probably a flaw in our industry, but I think that's the good part about our industry, right? The human element needs to be present because that is college football, right? Whether it's a poll, a Heisman vote, an All-American vote, what have you, the human element is essentially, the best thing we got going. Although some schools that missed the playoff will tell you maybe the BCS is where we need to go back to. But I certainly don't subscribe to that. So the subjectivity is still going to be there with schools that get out of the gate early. So for some who go by the volume and all that, yeah, Texas Tech's the #1 class in the country. For those of us who don't, and it's a little bit more subjective, like they're not going to be the #1 class in the country, but they certainly have the biggest class in the country. And there is still something to be said for that. So it can go both ways.
That's good. I love it. John, the next thing I want to get to is kind of a conversation about Texas, who has, again, had that recruiting empire over the entire state, arguably the best state in high school football, and really how we're not seeing that on the playing field. But first, I got to tell everybody at home about Built Bar. I promise John's not going anywhere, but first, Built Bar is your place to build your summer bod. Right now, go to Built.com and you can find these new Built Bar birthday cake puffs. Birthday cake puff, whether it's your birthday or not, these puffs are legit. 150 calories, only 150, and you're basically eating a candy bar. Most of those are 250 calories. Also, you get 16 grams of protein. Guess how many are in a candy bar? I don't know, but it can't be 16 grams. So you're also going to get in that only 9 grams of sugar. Most candy bars have 30 or above. You can stay healthy. You can build the summer bod. You can retain the summer bod without eating kale or lettuce all of the time, or skipping meals or skipping dessert, by eating a Built Bar puff, especially the birthday cake puffs. Go to Built.com, get the birthday cake puffs. Locked 15 gets you 15% off of your order. Locked 15 at Built.com. Again, birthday cake puffs. Just try it. Trust me. Now, John, as you can see around me, there's nothing left. No decor. I'm moving out of my house as Texas is moving to the SEC. Segue.
Look at them. Look at them.
And as they move, I'm sure their recruiting's only going to get better in undoubtedly the best conference in America when it comes to recruiting football players. But right now, what you're seeing is teams like Baylor that have mostly, 3-star guys with a couple of 4-stars sprinkled in every season, a 5-star every once in a blue moon, that are beating Texas. And the disconnect, where is, to you, from a recruiting standpoint and looking at what's on the field, the disconnect for a team in Texas that can't seem to put it all together?
Yeah, I don't think the Longhorns are alone on that front, by the way. Look, talent is one thing. That's just the first thing, right? The spectrum is talent identification and then acquisition. So those boxes check and check, right, for Texas. But then it's talent development. It is development. And when you go through multiple coaching staffs, scheme and philosophical changes, it is really hard to develop, because you're developing in two different directions in 2 different years, per se. So I do think that the radar and the spotlight is certainly on Texas. They need to have a good year. And you said, when they go to the SEC, they'll recruit even better. Maybe. They've got to win. I think if there is a recruit we talk to, and we talk to them all over the country, but if there's a recruit we talk to who is absolutely in tune with the on-field product, it is an SEC recruit. Because guess what? No pro teams in those areas. Basketball is not as big of a deal. It's about college football in those areas. So you can be a low-level recruit and have a very clear understanding of what Auburn, Alabama, Florida look like every single year. So I do think that while geographically, that should enhance what Texas has been able to do from a talent acquisition standpoint, the lack of development. I mean, we just saw the draft, right? How many Longhorns, Drake? I know you talked about it.
That's weird. I'm a journalism major. I'm not very good at math. I can only count to 0, so it won't carry that. Oh, it is. It's 0. I can do that
right.
one.
So that, you think an SEC recruit in Birmingham or Atlanta is going to keep an eye on that? Of course they are. So yes, we should assume that the talent pool will be bigger for Texas when they go to the SEC, but unless things are corrected on the field, it may not matter. They may be in that bottom tier in terms of actually putting together recruiting classes if things don't change on the field, which will probably mean another coaching change right when they get to the SEC, which is probably not ideal for anybody, over in Austin. So I do think the development and the lack thereof at Texas has been alarming and glaring. All the jokes about Texas being back, notwithstanding, they've been close. It's felt like things have trended in the right direction, only to be reset shortly thereafter. So I do think, even though it's only year 2 under Sarkisian, they've got to make moves this year. And the talent they have offensively, there is really no excuse for Texas this year. Look at their receiving core. They got maybe the best running back in the country. And whoever wins the job is going to be a very talented quarterback, maybe not experienced, but talented. Offensively, there's going to be no excuse. And that defense really has nowhere to go but up after what we saw on the field in Austin last year. So the developmental side has to change at Texas before they get to the SEC, because if not, they'll be, there'll be a glorified version of Missouri 2.0 when they came into the SEC, where they had a couple nice runs, but kind of forgettable thereafter. And that's crazy to even associate with Texas, but I think it's entirely possible if things don't change on the field and as early as 2022.
John, I don't want to give Texas a bunch of flack. That's not really the point of the segment. And I love that we're kind of taking an objective look at what's going on and why it's going on. And one of the things that I've just always wondered is, man, as much as Texas may lose, it feels like they're still getting those 5-star recruits. Even when the NIL wasn't a thing, Texas was still recruiting at an elite level. Does that come from being the flagship school of Texas? Does it come from the brand that it's built? How is Texas still recruited so consistently, even without consistent success on the field?
Yeah, I've talked to many of their commits and targets, and there is just a belief that it can't stay down. I think the longstanding brand is upholding a lot of the perception around recruits with Texas at this point. They visit Austin and love the town and all that stuff. Sure, the coaching staff is strong in place from a recruiting standpoint. So I do think that gives them a little bit more benefit of the doubt. In terms of last year's class, which was a top 5, top 10 type of group, the best O-line class in the country. Why? That was the worst O-line in the Big 12 last year. And kids were sold, hey, you can come in and play. And I don't know how many freshmen will start and or crack that rotation this fall, but it's going to be more than 1 or 2 conservatively. So I do think that there's still an element of, the team's not doing as good, but I can play early, build my brand, play on TV. All those things still do apply at a high level at a program like a Texas. So I do think they still receive a lot of the benefit of the doubt relative to other programs that are winning at the same pace as Texas is on the field. You would think that they would take a little bit more of a step back. And I do think that's a little bit more of an indication on the staff that Sarkisian's put together, which, again, is a strong recruiting staff. We'll see how they develop and adjust going into this fall. But yeah, I mean, the appeal of Texas is still the appeal of Texas. Let's not make a mistake about that one.
John, the next thing I want to get into is recruiting in the new Big 12. When you have 14 teams for 2 years, is what it looks like right now as Texas and Oklahoma have opted to stay in, and really how adding Houston, another Texas school, will change the front of recruiting for Baylor and the rest of us in the state. But first, betonline.ag. BetOnline.net, betonline.ag right now. Number one source for all things sports betting and sports betting info. You watch Game 7, the Dallas Mavericks just killed the Suns. So I'm looking there. I'm sitting. Second half, it was Suns minus 11, Dallas plus 11. I was like, I'm going to hammer Suns minus 11. They're not going to keep getting killed. They kept getting killed. Had you not been like me and bought on plus 11 for the Mavs, you could have won a lot of money on BetOnline. BetOnline, your source through the NBA playoffs as we get to the Western and Eastern Conference Finals, MLB as well, live betting, esports, casino-like gaming, and more at betonline.net, betonline.ag, BetOnline, where the game starts. John, the first question I want to pose to you comes in terms of 2025-26. Okay, so this is Texas is gone. Houston has now replaced Texas in the Big 12. Is that significant enough to change recruiting in the state of Texas at all? Or is that just kind of throwing in a team that's built a big bubble around its city pretty much in their recruiting scheme, and that's going to stay the same?
I think it's going to open things up for Houston. Obviously building a bubble around that city is very good for football recruiting. I mean, no kidding. That metro has become – I was just talking to someone else about this in Tennessee yesterday. That metro is becoming one of the best metros to recruit from a talent production standpoint. A lot of great talent there naturally. You had a lot of Katrina displacement in the last decade from Louisianans heading west. So it is bubbled up, and it's affordable. So it's bubbled up into this great metro to recruit from, and it's getting better seemingly by the year. So Houston can certainly survive off of that. But I do think, the difference between, and this goes for any school, Cincinnati, UCF, all of them, going from the group of 5 or independent in BYU's case to the Power 5 just brings you so much more validity. How many kids I talk to say, man, I've got Memphis, I've got UCF, I've got, Middle Tennessee. Man, I just want that first Power 5 offer. I hear that every week when I'm out at practices and on the phones. I just want that Power 5 offer. So now the front end of that doesn't exist with Houston. It is a Power 5 offer. So Houston will be, in theory, the first Power 5 offer for some of these Texas prospects. And that will matter. Power 5/Big 12. That will matter just as much, maybe even more on that front. So I do think it opens up a little bit more possibility in who they target and just the level of the offer from a very basic to understand standpoint. Look, it is a higher level offer the moment they get into the Big 12. It just is what it is. I think it's going to help all those schools, in particular Houston, because they're the one that's already in Texas, as you mentioned, and there's one major program leaving the Big 12. So in terms of the best Big 12 offers in state, if they went on the field and project in the right way, now all of a sudden they can contend as one of the best in-state offers you can grab. But again, just hitting that Power 5 threshold will be a big deal for Houston, but I would expect them to utilize that outside the city more than inside the city, getting into maybe the western part of the state, other parts of the state that are less populated and are just harder to recruit because there's just not as many kids or as many airports in the areas. I think those are the areas where Houston could really begin to benefit because they would have the resources to get in a car and do it, as opposed to schools coming into the Big 12 that are further away, like all the other ones.
So you have sold me not only on playing football in Houston, but also moving there after college for cheap living and the refuge of Katrina. That's not where I thought we'd end up going with that conversation. But even still, along with Houston, you talked about BYU, UCF, and Cincinnati. You add those 4 teams into the conference, and even now looking at the next 2 years, past next fall, where you have 14 teams in the Big 12, almost inevitably, because Texas and Oklahoma have made it clear they don't want to leave early. And
I don't blame them, by the way.
They don't want to pay to leave early, at least, right? I'm sure they want to, or the buffer, at least, aside. And those 4 teams coming in, how much does that? This is going to be the least professional thing I think I've said on the show. How much does that screw with Baylor in recruiting?
It does. I think every one of those schools will dip into Texas more, maybe outside of BYU. That's such a niche school and offer and presentation that I'm not sure if that will mean more Texans are that much more likely to go up to Utah. But I do think certainly Cincinnati and UCF, those coaching staffs are chomping at the bit to recruit more Texans. It's probably already started, as we talk about it. I'm sure they've looked into Texas more just because of what is happening for them on the field, because now they can sell those parents on, hey, now you can come down to Florida, enjoy Disney World and all that. And then, hey, every other year we'll be here to play, close to your house on top of it. So at Cincinnati, same thing, right? Sell a pro city atmosphere, a big metro atmosphere, but also with the ability to come back to Texas. And obviously the on-field success of those two in particular will sell in and of itself with Texans that are looking for other programs. So yeah, it will quote unquote screw with Baylor to a degree, but I think the style of those programs are very different. UCF, Gus Malzahn, power spread offense, spot recruiting defensively with talent, more of an NFL scheme. Cincinnati, very much an NFL scheme defensively, pro style on offense. Baylor's going to profile differently than some of those programs. A little bit more aggressive on defense, more niche in terms of the type of athletic profile that Dave Aranda wants to go after. So it won't be as sweeping as maybe, the pessimistic Baylor fan might expect. But it will certainly, head to head, I do think you'll see more UCFs and Cincinnati's and Houston's popping into the top groups and official visit schedules for some of the Baylor targets that otherwise wouldn't have those schools in there, because now, again, those are Power 5 options.
John, before we get you out of here, I know that there's a new Sports Illustrated outlet covering Baylor sports specifically. Want to give you time to plug your stuff, plug that, and let folks at home know what's going on and where they can find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Inside the Bears is the website. You could just go to si.com/college/Baylor. Really simple there. Just launched, I believe, last week on Friday. So a ton of content to dig into there. They track recruiting every day. So certainly I'll be popping over to help them out with some day-to-day content and, another Big 12 program in the state of Texas to track on the SI network. So certainly we'll be more aware of Baylor, just like we've tried to be for you guys here at Locked On.
I love it. Well, John, thanks as always for great stuff, breaking down the Big 12, the new Big 12. I know you got so much to see, so much to do. What's wrong with taking the back? It's something like that. So thanks again. Always a pleasure.
Take care, Drake. Safe travels.
Thank you. Now, before we get you out of here, I want to let you know that tomorrow's show, Peter Pope is going to join us from Our Daily Bears and Our Daily Podcast. That is not a daily podcast. Speaking of, if you haven't listened to this week's version of Our Daily Podcast, I joined the guys, Fank and Pope, and it was fun. Those guys are, it was fun. It was actually really fun. So go give it a listen. Those guys are awesome. Always been one of my favorite podcasts to listen to across the Baylor sphere. And thank you for making Locked On Baylor your first listen every single day. Make your second listen Locked On Big 12. Josh Neighbors will give you everything Big 12 in a half hour or less. He is an expert when it comes to the conference and is always breaking things down like we did today from a pretty Big 12 perspective. Pretty Big 12 perspective with John Garcia. And again, come back tomorrow for Peter Pope of Our Daily Bears. You don't want to miss it. And thank you for not missing today's show that has been Locked On. I almost said Our Daily Bears. Baylor.